we got some news on the sports guy this week. And it's not that he spoiled the ending of Landman, which I just thought was one of the most egregious moments in the history of podcasting. I was stunned as it was happening. Like, did you listen to it on Monday?
I did not.
Okay. So like him and cousin Sal are just casually talking about the Shakey's game. And then Bill out of the blue just spoils a key plot point in the season finale of Landman, which aired a week ago. And cousin Sal immediately jumped down his throat. Bill went searching for somebody to agree with him. His producer didn't agree with him. The YouTube chat didn't agree with him. Like Bill very clearly was out of bounds. I just think for somebody who has spent his career marrying pop culture and sports, like the idea in the streaming era of spoiling a series finale on a streaming show 1 week after it aired, I thought was totally egregious. I just had to get that off my chest.
I appreciate you getting off your chest, and the Bill Simmons subreddit, which we will check in on momentarily, absolutely agreed with you. The most ridiculous part of it that the comment section of that subreddit brought up that I thought was hilarious is it's a podcast. I mean, I know that it was live in the moment, but the audio version also had it. So they didn't even cut it, despite all the chatter in real time about if it was appropriate or not. No one agreed with him, and then he still was like, nah, keep it in.
I included that in my article. Like, I thought you're right. Like, it aired on the YouTube feed, whatever. They're a lost cause. Most people I know listen to it in podcast form. Would have been very easy to edit it out, and for whatever reason, they kept it in, spoiler and all. So anyways, that's not the news. The news is a report from Semafor, which has since been corroborated by Ryan Glasspiegel at Front Office Sports, that Bill Simmons is likely to renew with Spotify when his contract comes up next month. This had been a story that Glasspiegel had actually reported on back in August. I don't know if we ever talked about this on the podcast. We might have not even had a podcast at this point, or might have been in one of our test episodes. But basically, Bill's 5-year deal with Spotify was coming due. So there was some speculation that could he go somewhere else? Could he start his own platform? But it sounds like he's staying put at Spotify. The wording in the Semafor report was kind of vague. It basically said he was just going to, it almost sounded like an extension of his current deal. I don't know what the mechanisms are there for how that's going to work. But then Glassbeak also added a nugget that ESPN is open to doing business with Bill Simmons if it makes sense, which kind of sounded like a boilerplate answer of we're open to anything if it makes sense.
Well, and notably didn't have a Simmons has explored, Simmons has asked, Simmons would be interested. It was just like, somebody got the idea to ask ESPN if they would welcome Bill Simmons doing something there. And it's like, well, what are you going to say? No. I mean, at that point, it's so open-ended. Well, of course, sure, whatever, we'll do it.
Yeah. I mean, they're licensing out all their stuff now. So
if he wanted to do produce a doc for them, or, I mean, who knows? Who knows what that could mean? But yeah, I mean, I think that Simmons' exact situation at Spotify has always been a little bit cloudy beyond just running the Ringer and doing his podcast, right? Like he has this head of monetization and growth title for their podcast arm and everything. And I think that the initial reporting here had some details about, big projects down the line and all that sort of stuff. But I'll be curious to kind of see what all it means. I think that it's interesting to, we should talk about some of the other rumors, that ESPN thing, the Fanatics angle of it, the fact last year of, could he launch something like a Grantland 3.0, which was kind of out there for a minute. And that's all, at age 55 for him, I think kind of fascinating. But Spotify is a kind of a different company than it was when it bought the Ringer, right? So, they spent all this money, and then all their investment in acquisitions and licensing deals, most of them outside of Joe Rogan, which is now in a different form, are done with. And it's kind of just the Ringer, which they now own, so they can't get rid of it. And then Rogan kind of halfway, and that's it. So what is the role of growth and monetization for a company that's not really developing so much of its own stuff anymore? That's, I think, an open question.
Yeah, real quick, I'll get back to that, I promise. But we definitely have talked about this, because I remember you asking me to predict where he would end up. And there was just never an obvious answer. It was no Bill's, he's not going to go back to ESPN and be a columnist or even launch his own vertical with ES. Like Bill is too big to just be an employee. He is a Pat McAfee level type of talent who is going to own and produce his own stuff and then sell it to somebody or license it out, which is ultimately what he did at Spotify. And yeah, if he wanted to launch a new version of the Ringer / Grantland, I'm sure he could license it to ESPN, but he's not going to go build a vertical for ESPN. So I just, to me, this conversation was never about what does Bill Simmons want to do. It was about what is Spotify's strategy, which you referenced, because we have seen a lot of high profile departures from Spotify. And I mean, if they're letting go of Joe Rogan, or if they're, kind of loosening the reins there with what they were doing with Joe, then I think it's very fair to wonder, like, are they still in the Bill Simmons business? Now, obviously now we know the answer is yes. And in terms of what this means for them going forward, the thing that really crystallized for me that he was staying was this pivot to video that Spotify is making, because you see how heavily they're involving the Ringer in it. You're seeing them. I mean, as far as I know, the first podcast they launched as a video podcast in their app was the Bill Simmons podcast. And now you're seeing it slowly trickle to other Ringer podcasts as well. So I think that the Ringer is going to be heavily involved in whatever Spotify is trying to do with video moving forward. And obviously if the Ringer's involved, then, Bill Simmons is the Ringer effectively.
Yeah, it's all kind of fascinating, right? Because like, I covered last year before JJ Redick left ESPN. He and Bill Simmons got into kind of a war of words over video, and Redick kind of threw a jab at Simmons specifically as kind of the person at the Ringer who was resistant to making their stuff available there. And I think that the MO at the Ringer had always kind of been that, like, podcasts are audio, we do video, but those aren't the same thing. I guess I just somewhat wonder how much of that, like, if they weren't owned by Spotify, would that have still been the case when Spotify was a subscription audio service that you listen to, like, Bob Dylan and audiobooks on, in addition to podcasts that they're making? I don't know, because the video revolution of podcasting kind of came after Spotify had already bought them up, and so it's hard to tell. But clearly they wanted to kind of distinguish those things and then, like, make it exclusive in some kind of way. And Simmons, I think, is exactly the type of person you would want to have on your platform if you're doing that, because he's in the class of, I mean, Rogan's huge on YouTube too, but his audio is a monster. Him and Mark Maron and some of these people, where just audio for those shows, Bill Simmons has literally said, funded the Ringer when it launched. Like, that's how much revenue he brings in. So it makes sense to keep him audio, but I would imagine that what they started to find out is, like, growth is really hard to do when you're only on audio. And in some cases, some of their stuff was, like, exclusive to Spotify and whatever else. That's really, really a tough ask in this environment. And so now they're like kind of the tip of the spear of Spotify expanding into video. And Spotify's not just expanding into video, but they're trying to be a YouTube competitor. They're paying creators to come put their content on Spotify instead of YouTube. And, like, people who are, like Mr. Beast knockoffs should be here too, not just podcasters. Like, just video content should live here. And I don't know if that'll work. Good luck taking on YouTube. I mean, I know Spotify, like, revolutionized the whole music industry, but YouTube's a whole different thing. But yeah, I absolutely think that just like Spotify and the Ringer, or just like the Ringer and Simmons have been the people that Spotify used to try out their live video, their live audio products, and some of their exclusive narrative podcasts and some of these other things to see if people will bite. I think they absolutely will be that for video. But I guess to sum it all up, the funny thing about this to me is Simmons one of the biggest things that they've butted heads over, if you read the reporting, is that Simmons never wanted any of the content to be exclusive to Spotify, that it had to be on Apple, it had to be everywhere else. And at the same time that Spotify is doing all this with video, the Ringer, not so coincidentally, everything's on YouTube now. And so it's always kind of this interesting thing of, like, Spotify's business strategy versus the Ringer revenue generation and what Simmons is okay with and everything else. And I guess that's kind of going to be the mission for this new contract, is to kind of take them into whatever the next iteration of podcasting and video podcasting looks like. But he's going to do it his own way, I think, because that's just Bill Simmons.
So what else do we think happens here? Because obviously he's staying at Spotify. He'll continue to build the Spotify, the Ringer podcast network at Spotify as we currently know it, and whatever it looks like in video form. But even if it's not at ESPN, which I don't think it will be at ESPN, although I guess that is a possibility. Like, do we think we'll start to see, I guess, more of an increased media presence from Bill Simmons as he enters this stage of his career in his late 50s, especially in light of the new NBA deals coming into effect, I guess would be the big question.
Yeah. And I think on top of that too, right? Like, once you do open yourself up to video, that makes your product sellable to more buyers, right? So like, it could originate as a Spotify product, but we've already seen them kind of do this with FanDuel, put some content elsewhere. I don't know. I mean, what do you think? Like, I feel like the real kind of big question there is like, does this return spell the end of Bill Simmons as a TV personality? Because he had, NBA Countdown. They did some stuff with Grantland. He did the HBO show. He was a guy that was like a fill-in dude on PTI and other things back in his early ESPN days. Is this just the end of that for him, or do you think that he would still want back in? I don't know. A lot of that stuff hasn't gone particularly well.
Well, I was going to say, the end is been here. Like, he hasn't really done anything on TV in a long time as a front-facing figure. I mean, he's produced Yacht Rock documentaries and the Andre the Giant documentary and, done stuff like that. But really, ever since Any Given Wednesday, like, I don't really recall the last time he was heavily involved as an on-air figure for something outside of Ringer content. So maybe we're already there, and maybe it's just wishful thinking on my end, but like, I'd like to see him like hop on the Amazon broadcasts or hop on the show. I think it would have to be Amazon because he's pretty vocal about how he feels about, the restrictive nature of broadcast television and in studio shows. But I'd like to see it. I mean, it's kind of just throwing it out there because it's not anything he's done in close to a decade now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess you could make the case that like this Ringer chapter, seeing through the sale and then now re-upping with Spotify and that arrangement, like going according to plan, that this would kind of be the opportunity to do it. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, the studio environment was restrictive when he did it at ESPN, but he was also on the show that's like most known for being restrictive, which is their NBA studio show. So, maybe there's a world in which Amazon or NBC offer him something that's a little bit looser that makes sense, or he continues to build out alternatives at other places like the FanDuel network. I don't know. I mean, I think that's kind of the detail that I'm curious about with this cracked is, was he restricted on the first Spotify deal, and now he has freedoms, or kind of what would be the situation there? What do you think? You said wishful thinking. You want him back. Do you think he is, or are we just latching on to a bygone generation of talking heads, and we gotta get over it?
Yeah, I think he's probably done. I don't think he enjoyed the experience on Countdown. Obviously, we know how Any Given Wednesday went. I just don't. There's no track record for it, within the last decade, really, of him wanting to do this. And I don't know. I mean, maybe he's burned some bridges that we don't know about with what he says about these studio shows, even though we're talking about hypothetical studio shows that don't even exist yet for NBC and Amazon. But I don't think it's happening. That would be my answer.
To Simmons' credit, he also has proven that he's a person that, even with people like JJ Redick pointing out that you have to be on video to go viral, Simmons continued and continues to have a really prominent voice that breaks through, even just doing kind of a, more limited output kind of thing. And so maybe there's just no need. It's not like he is desperate for a platform or something where he can do a Sunday evening podcast with Ryan Russillo. And I don't know about you, but when I turn on my local Phoenix radio station, what he and Russillo talk about leads the NBA conversation without being on TV. So maybe that's on people like us just thinking of that as a thing he needs to level back up to, when that's just not even what it is anymore.
No, I mean, he's very much still a tastemaker, I'd say, especially when it comes to the NBA. And I mean, we write about him a decent amount, and I can tell you based on the traffic, he still kind of moves the needle. He doesn't do bonkers numbers or anything like that, but he's somebody people are definitely interested in. I mean, we're spending a whole segment talking about him here on this podcast. And yeah, I mean, especially I think in terms of national voices when it comes to the NBA, I mean, it's Stephen A. Smith, it's Charles Barkley, and it's Bill Simmons, and Bill Simmons probably has the most appeal to the diehard fans talking about the nitty gritty of the NBA, even if he doesn't always, know the full mechanisms of the trade machine or anything like that. He still very much moves the needle when it comes to his NBA discourse.
Another place that Bill Simmons moves the needle is on Reddit, where we return to views from the subreddit, my favorite new bit that we have here on the podcast, where we just, these personalities have some fans that tend to go crazy, and it can be fun to see what they're thinking. So this one actually is not about Bill Simmons, but it is from the Bill Simmons subreddit, Ben. Here it is in its totality, the post. I just watched 10 minutes of the Pat McAfee show. What the fuck is this shit? This is the dumbest shit I've ever seen, and Any Given Wednesday should have been in this time slot. Your thoughts?
Any Given Wednesday at noon during the week, every day. I think they had hard enough time filling an hour on Wednesday nights. I don't know about every day. I definitely get the sense there's not a lot of crossover between Pat McAfee's audiences and Bill Simmons' audiences.
Given Bill Simmons' impression of the Pat McAfee show that went a little viral this past year, I think that tells you all you need to know. If Bill doesn't get it, I doubt his fans do.
Yeah.
I think what's Bill's audience demographic? 35 to 55-year-old dudes?
I'm 36, and I would say I am on the younger end of it. So, yeah, probably right. 35 to 50. Yeah, that's probably right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's people who grew up with him, really. I mean, I would think.
Yeah, who read Page 2 and everything. I think that I grew up with Grantland, and then that just sort of bled over. But yeah, I'm not well represented in the demographic. I don't feel like I have a home there in the Bill Simmons audience, being not quite 35 myself yet, but that's all right.